Resident Evil 3, the direct sequel to 2019's excellent Resident Evil 2 remake and what was many people's game of the year for 2019. Is this a worthy successor to such a great adventure, or was this a disappointing mess? That's what we're going to find out today, so without further ado, let's hop into it. Right off the bat, let's go ahead and tackle some of the common criticisms that have been circulating the internet around Resident Evil 3. The first of which definitely being Nemesis. A lot of people are highly disappointed in Nemesis this year. I think they were expecting something similar to Mr. X, a lot of dynamic gameplay, not so scripted, not so many quick time events. And that's what we have here. We have a lot more scripted events, a lot more quick time events, and really when you fight him, it's more arena battle style, much more like other video games. And I think that's because they're different bosses. Mr. X is more atmospheric, whereas Nemesis, with the quick time events, with the amount of cutscenes that he's much more cinematic, and he is dynamic in the very beginning of the game. For instance, when you're running around Raccoon City, there is a part where he's chasing you through Raccoon City, and that is about the closest you get to a Nemesis similar to the style of Mr. X. Now, is that a bad thing? I don't think so. I'll get into that more later in the video, but Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, I think, are two very different games, even though they feel similar, they play similar, they look similar, but they're going after two different outcomes. And so I think Nemesis plays his part well in Resident Evil 3. I will admit Mr. X's scare factor definitely came from how dynamic he was, stalking you through the RPD hallways, and you never knew where exactly he was going to come from. If you tried to shoot at a zombie in the library, he would hear those gunshots and he would come, bust down the door and come after you. He was very scary in that sense. However, I think I found Nemesis much more scary than Mr. X in certain aspects because of his agility, his weaponry. He's just a much more aggressive foe. He'll run after you and he can catch up to you no problem. It's not like Mr. X where he's kind of just speed walking at best. No, Nemesis is very fast. You really do have to go inside the buildings and try to outmaneuver him. You have to use that dodge mechanic that's introduced here. Now, the second criticism is a short campaign. This is a fair point. In Resident Evil 2, my first run took around 6.5 hours, my second about 5. I was new to the style of Resident Evil games though, and trying to look for all the items in all the rooms. I wanted to gather all the herbs, all the ammo, all the pouches, everything. In Resident Evil 3, my time took about 6 hours for my first playthrough, and Resident Evil 2 also had the Ghost Survivors free LC, as well as, I believe it's Hux, that Force Survivor. And Resident Evil 3, I think, tries to get around that by having a shop system, a point system. And I'll get more into that in the gameplay section. That does add some replayability. It does encourage you to have a second playthrough, a third playthrough, but it's not as good as a Ghost Survivors free LC. I think RE3 could benefit highly from having a similar thing to the Ghost Survivors, or they could do something like add a Mercenaries mode down the road. I think that's the best way to circumvent this criticism and to add more game value down the line. However, RE3 is overall more cinematic than RE2. There's more cutscenes, more quick time events, and I think that plays into the runtime. When I played through RE3, I felt like It was nonstop, heart pumping, adrenaline filled action from start to finish. It flowed very well. It didn't feel too long or too short. And I finished it in one single sitting. It was very engaging. So it is a short campaign, but it's a very high quality campaign. The gameplay here in Resident Evil 3 plays very much similar to Resident Evil 2 Remake, as you would expect it to. The gunplay is excellent. It feels very responsive and punchy. The dodge mechanic, that's the new mechanic added in, I found to be a little iffy. It got me attacked about as much as it got me out of bad situations, so I really didn't use it all that much outside of boss battles that I had to use it in. I have heard people online say that you can cheese with it if you get really, really good at it, but you definitely can't dodge directly past a zombie. I found the most helpful thing to be dodging, sort of side strafing the zombie rather than trying to get past it. And there is a mechanic that they took out from Resident Evil 2, that being the second chance mechanic. The second chance mechanic was the one where if you had a knife on you, you could stab the zombie and get out of its hold without it biting you and lowering your health. Or you could do the same thing with a flash grenade or a hand grenade. And they took that out. I'm not sure why. It was a very cool mechanic in Resident Evil 2. I used it a lot. I found it more helpful, honestly, than the dodge mechanic. The other gameplay change is there is much less backtracking and puzzles. At the beginning, when you're going through Raccoon City, is probably the most backtracking you do. That, and also a part in a hospital when you play as Carlos, that's also a great level, and that does have some backtracking as well. But there is a severe lack of puzzles compared to Resident Evil 2. That is something I missed, but it does go along with that more cinematic feel that Resident Evil 3 is going for, as there's no puzzles to slow down the pace, or there's not as many puzzles to slow down the action, adrenaline pumping pace of the game from getting you from point A to point B. The other big change with gameplay is that it is much more leaning on the action aspect as opposed to the survival horror aspect. It still is survival horror. It still has that item management aspect where, especially at the beginning, you just don't seem to have enough inventory space for everything, so you're kind of picking and choosing. Okay, do I want to pick up this green herb, or instead do I want to pick up this box of shotgun shells? And so it does still have that item management, still has the survival horror atmosphere, but as opposed to the second game, you get plenty of ammo, especially when you're playing as Carlos with that assault rifle. For some reason, he doesn't have much ammo in his pistol, but for the assault rifle, he has a ton. Given it can take for some zombies almost a clip of his assault rifle ammo, so 32 bullets, but for most zombies, they don't take nearly that much. He just has a ton of ammo. I pretty much never went below 100 rounds for his assault rifle. His story definitely leans way far into the action. Jill's is, I would say, kind of a combination between the survival horror and the action. Carlos is much more action. When playing as Carlos, it felt closer to playing something like Resident Evil 5 that I used to play back in the day. Yet again, the RE engine impresses. It proves time and time again with RE2 Remake first, and now with the RE3 Remake, that it is one of the most impressive engines out right now, between the audio as well as the graphics. Starting with the audio, the gunfire sounds punchy, the zombie sounds are unsettling, the zombie dogs are terrifying. They give me goosebumps every time I see them running at me and hear them. The graphics front, the character models are affected by weather. That's one of those tiny details, sort of like footprints in the snow in Red Dead Redemption 2, that really just impresses. Nowadays, graphics are so good, it's hard to impress people. It's those tiny details that really set games apart now, and this game has that. Character models, if they're in the rain, they're going to be soaking, they're going to have raindrops dripping off their clothes, and they're going to have a sheen to their hair that the lighting's going to reflect off of differently. It is very detailed, very great, and the cutscenes are even better. Seamless cutscenes, by the way, between gameplay and cutscenes. It is seamless. They're very close to one another. And in the cutscenes, the main difference to me is the facial expressions. I'm pretty certain that this has been improved since RE2. I finished RE2 about 3 days before RE3 came out, so it was pretty fresh in my mind, and I remember that was one of the things that really impressed me, was the facial expressions during cutscenes, really portraying that emotion that they're trying to get across to the player. Excellent, excellent on that front. Now, one objective negative is the downgraded gore system in this game. Instead of in RE2 how you would shoot an arm and it would kind of dangle on the zombie until it just fell off, very gross, and it would just lay there the whole game. Instead of that, if you shoot an arm or a leg in this game, it just explodes into blood and then it disappears. It doesn't stick around. So that is an objective downgrade. However, with that being said, I didn't find it to hinder my experience. In fact, I think I probably only noticed it because of watching maybe 4 or 5 reviews before playing the game. And, once something like that's mentioned, it's hard not to notice. But if you weren't aware of it before you played, then you probably wouldn't notice, or you might notice later down the line in the game. It's not something that you should really look at as, should I not buy this game because of it? It's a downgrade, but it's not impactful on your experience. As I touched on in Nemesis, the story contains many more cutscenes than Resident Evil 2, as well as Nemesis being more on the scripted fight side of things, where there's clearly an arena that you're going to fight him in, much less dynamic than Mr. X. However, there is still that survival horror element with the item management, but what we have here, it feels more like a Resident Evil action movie as opposed to Resident Evil 2, which was much more atmospheric and much more frightening on that gameplay sense of it. Here, you really are drawn in by the story. If the story doesn't grab you, then you're going to get a lot less out of this game. However, what we have here isn't just a Resident Evil action movie. It's a damn good Resident Evil action movie, and I'll stick by that. This story was engaging. I liked the characters. In fact, I loved all the characters. The character arcs were engaging, and the storyline drew me in, which is why Resident Evil 2, much more of a game, I completed that over the course of maybe a week. And Resident Evil 3, which took me about as long as my first run on Resident Evil 2, I finished in a single sitting in, I think, a Saturday. I finished it in a single sitting. It was just too engaging to put down. And that's what really makes a good story. If I feel like, okay, now's a good place to pause, that's a classic game element. Fair enough, games are much longer than movies. But if you really are just going to ask someone to stick through it and sit down in one sitting and play through a video game, that is a damn good story. Now, the other thing it does well that I enjoyed was it explained how some Resident Evil 2 bodies end up in places at the RPD. Now, this is something you will enjoy a ton if you play Resident Evil 2 first, and I highly, highly recommend that if you have not played Resident Evil 2, you do play Resident Evil 2 before you play Resident Evil 3. You will get a ton more out of it when you get through the police station section as Carlos, because he has some really great commentary on the police station, most of which is passive when you're walking by strange things. And there's stuff where when you'll play Resident Evil 2, you'll think it to yourself, and Carlos will comment the exact thing that you thought. And that is just awesome, as well as showing you how some of those bodies got there, giving a little bit of backstory to the RPD. It really is great. Some of them, I will give a heads up, you do have to aim your gun at. For instance, in the police station, there is a welcome poster for Leon Kennedy, who's one of the characters you can play as in Resident Evil 2. Now, that's not a passive action where Carlos will like just walk by it and mention that. You actually have to aim your gun at it for a second or two, and then he'll make a funny comment about it. So there is that. Some of them you will want to aim your gun at, and other ones, the majority of which you just walk past and he'll comment like, why are the doors, like, why is there a diamond door? That's a weird door. And it's very relatable if you played Resident Evil 2, because it's what you thought. Now, here is where things start to fall flat. Resident Evil Resistance, the multiplayer Resident Evil game mode that was thrown along with Resident Evil 3. As some people expected, it feels like padding for not having multiple playthroughs. At best, it's a distraction for maybe 1 to 3 games in a sitting, each game being about 6 to 7 minutes. I think the longest I've seen was 15, but it's not something you're going to put in Resident Evil 3 into your console and boot it up just to play Resident Evil Resistance. It's very much just a small distraction that maybe you'll play Resident Evil 3 for a bit and then think, I'll play a match or two of Resident Evil Resistance. For the gameplay aspect, the survivors, there's 3 stages. The first 2 are about gathering items to open a door, with the third being breaking these canisters. The mastermind, on the other hand, has a small card deck that changes periodically. Most interesting part of the game for sure is playing as the mastermind. The survivors do have some power-ups that they can use. However, the girl that's the medic is really the only great one. She's the one that you have to have on your team, basically. And the reason for that is her biggest power-up is a basically search and detect power-up, where she'll scan the area for items, aka scan the area for the keys that you need to open these doors. And so she is a must-have. All the other characters are kind of eh. And with the mastermind, you're looking through all these cameras and you can control some of the zombies, as well as your ultimate will change depending on which mastermind you are. If you're a Net Birkin, your ultimate is going to be her husband, who's, has that G virus in him. And if you're, I forget the mastermind that has this one, but one of them has Mr. X that you can control. I'm sure that one's a lot of fun. However, whichever you're playing, Survivors or Mastermind, it feels like a chore. It's not a lot of fun. It might be fun for 1 or 2 matches, but at the end of the day, it feels like a chore. The enemies, as the Mastermind's perspective, the enemies don't feel very dangerous. They're very inconsistent and lack aggression, I find. When I would spawn enemies, I could spawn them in the same room as the survivors, and they would just stand behind a desk waiting to get shot at by the survivors. And when you're a survivor, the maps are incredibly annoying with how linear they are. And on top of that, the enemies are super buggy and again, inconsistent. Sometimes in your favor, where I was a survivor one time and there was a whole pack of dogs that just ran at me and then stopped and ran away from me. So in that case, it was hugely in my favor where I was able to just shoot them because they just weren't focusing on me for whatever reason. And as the mastermind, it's annoying because whoever sent that dog was obviously assuming that that dog would attack me and lower my health. And by lowering my health, it would lower the time that me and the other survivors had to complete our mission of opening that door. Instead, the dogs lagged out or just were buggy and stopped aggroing on me for some reason. And because I was able to kill these zombie dogs, it actually added time to the time that me and my survivors had to open that door. So it really did the complete opposite for the mastermind, didn't help him at all. And it's also just very buggy, like I said. It's when you're the survivor, you'll see the zombies and the dogs especially are the worst. Their movement is very rubber bandy, and sometimes they'll move to the side and they won't stumble towards you properly like in the single player game. It's definitely not well optimized, and again, I think that could be a fun little distraction. But if you're thinking, oh, maybe I want to buy Resident Evil 3 because I really want a multiplayer Resident Evil game, you don't want to buy Resident Evil 3 for Resident Evil Resistance. You do not want to do that. I would say the most value it adds is probably $10, maybe 15. It's a cool concept, and I think if they worked out some of the bugs, it would be a lot better. I think it could be similar to how a game like Friday the 13th or what's that other one that's similar to Friday the 13th, where there's one player after a whole group of other players. It could be fun and very much like that if they just worked out some of the kinks and bugs. On the bright side, it's not too hard to get into a match right now. It takes about between 1 and 2 minutes. However, because of the lack of longevity of the game, I don't see that being the case for a whole lot longer. I think over the coming months, it's just going to die out completely, especially because the leveling up system is a huge, huge grind. You get points for complete, or not even winning, you just get points for playing the game that you can use on cosmetics and action items. And when you're the survivors, it's annoying because you only unlock the different levels for the character you play as, which your character that you like may not be available every time you play. So that can be annoying. And also, it's a grind. You don't get a ton of points per match, and the only way to get a point boost is through paying real money. And so it definitely it feels like they made it a grind on purpose to try to get some extra money out of people that really did want to play the game. It's not worth it. Adds maybe $10 in value, I'd say. That's all I'll say on that. Now the time has come for my overall thoughts on Resident Evil 3, the follow-up to the great game Resident Evil 2. And was it worth $60? Is it a worthy follow-up to Resident Evil 2? We're going to see here. So, right off the bat, I think the game is an excellent game. Great callbacks to Resident Evil 2. Very fun in that respect. It's also very cinematic. So, another Resident Evil 2. It very much feels like a movie version of Resident Evil 2. And like a great movie though, I finished Resident Evil 3 and I immediately wanted to play it again. I'm on my second playthrough as I'm recording this, having just as much fun as my first playthrough. And usually I judge games by the amount of money I put into it plus the amount of hours I get out of it. So in this case, I spent $60 as it is a new game. For that $60, I got about 6 hours of gameplay out of that first playthrough. I won't count, a second playthrough or speed runs and stuff like that, because that's not for everyone. Some people are just going to want to play this one time, enjoy it, and then be done with it. For that, they're going to get about 6 hours out. Could range about 6 to 6.5 if you're really searching for everything, or even be 5.5 if you're not really searching every room, you're just kind of getting through the story. And so for $10 per hour of gameplay, it is on the steep side. It's not as good of value as Resident Evil 2 was from a gameplay perspective. However, Resident Evil 3 is very high quality, which I think counts for a lot. I would rather have a high quality game than a game that's fluffed out, that has padding that it doesn't necessarily need to. For instance, they could have added some levels that might have added another hour or two of gameplay. But what is that worth if it throws off the natural progression of the game, the flow of the story, which is so perfectly balanced in this game, as it is so action-packed, so adrenaline-pumping from start to finish. It's just a thrill ride. And so taking into account the high quality of the game, plus the steep price of $60, but also Resident Evil Resistance being a $10 to $15 value, I think this game is probably fairly priced at $50. However, I don't think you'll regret paying $60 for the game if you played and enjoy Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 is a probably better purchase on the whole if you haven't played either of the games. For one thing, you're going to get more out of Resident Evil 3 if you've played Resident Evil 2. And on the other end of things, there is more gameplay on offer in Resident Evil 2. So Resident Evil 2 I would recommend for somebody who hasn't played either of the games and is deciding between. For somebody who's played Resident Evil 2 and really enjoyed it, I think you'll have a fantastic time in Resident Evil 3. I think it is worth picking up. And for people who are on the fence because they recognize that $60, it's a little steep for the amount of hours that you get out of this game, I think it would be fair to say that maybe wait until the game is around $50. I think $50 is probably, in its current state, a fair price for this game. I had a ton of fun with this game. $50 would have felt like a steal. $60 I did not regret, but I recognize that it is a steep price for the game. So with that being said, was Resident Evil 3 a proper successor? Was it worthy? I think it was. It is a different game, much more cinematic, much more of a movie experience in my eyes than a game experience. And for a movie experience, it was a damn good adventure. With all that being said, I would love to hear your guys' opinions down in the comments below. What did you like about Resident Evil 3? What didn't you like about Resident Evil 3? And where do you think that Capcom should go with this series next? Should they do what rumor has it apparently, a Resident Evil 4 remake? Or, in my opinion, I would love to see them do a Resident Evil 0 or a Resident Evil 1 remake in the same vein they did 2 and 3. But let me know your guys' opinions down in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this content, please do give it a like and subscribe for more.
It's this foundation that will continue to build a brighter future for all of us.